It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Rebecca Henderson. Rebecca is a Harvard University professor, a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a fellow of the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her research explores the degree to which the private sector can play a major role in building a more sustainable economy. She sits on the board of IDX Laboratories and Ceres, and she recently wrote a fantastic book, which you should all run out and buy immediately, called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. The world is on fire, and we do need to reimagine capitalism. It was shortlisted for the Financial Times McKinsey 2020 Business Book of the Year Award. And to learn more about Rebecca's work, visit her website, www.rebeccahenderson.com. So, Rebecca, welcome. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Jonathan, thank you. It's so much fun to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
You're great. Okay, so let's begin with the beginning. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in London, just off Kensington High Street.
And in your early years, were there any elements of your early years that you are finding actually are seeds of the DNA in your background that are kind of unfolding now?
I always loved the outside. I spent a lot of time rambling in the British countryside, and it was always a refuge for me. My childhood was a little bit tumultuous, and being able to get out into forests and walk along streams was always central. So that's been a central part of my life as long as I can remember, and is important now. And then the other part of my childhood, and I have no idea where this comes from, Jonathan, is I always wanted to know what was going on, and particularly what was going on in those big buildings you passed when you drove through cities. You know, what happens in factories and offices, and how does the world work? I always was curious, just super, super curious.
Well, you're certainly bringing those two together. So I'm going to jump through your career. Well, you know, you're an amazing undergraduate, and you had a graduate career and a PhD, and all of a sudden you were an advisor to the top companies of the world, not the Fortune 500, but like the Fortune 10. How did that happen?
In a minute?
Well, no, we got an hour. You take as much time as you want.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think little by little and then all at once. So it's important to know that I'm British. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, I went back to London to see if I really wanted to emigrate to the United States. I did my undergraduate degree in the US, and I went to work for McKinsey. And working for McKinsey in the early 80s meant closing plants in Northern England. That was the agenda on the big consulting companies. So I remember one client in particular where they had to move the computers out of the buildings before they announced to the workforce that they were shutting down the plant. And I remember being part of that, and I remember how stressful it was. And I also remember thinking, well, why is this happening? These are companies with 100-year-old brand names, and the economy is booming, global economy is booming. Like, what is happening? And that kicked off my enduring professional interest in change. And so that's what I did when I first took a faculty position, and I became the Eastman Kodak Chair of Management at MIT, which was deeply ironic in so many ways, because that's what I studied. I studied firms like Kodak. I worked with Nokia as Apple was just coming up, trying to persuade them that the smartphone was really a threat and they should get with the program. And well, since we know what happened to Nokia, and if you don't know the name, which tells you what happened to Nokia. I didn't have much success, but I was deeply interested in why is it that even when sort of most people can see that something's up, big firms, big organizations, they continue to deny what's happening. And when they do acknowledge what's happening, they tend to react very slowly and ineffectively. And all I can say, Jonathan, is if you get to be at least interesting in that area, lots of large companies come to call. So that's how I started working with large firms. I had a few ideas, I was plausible in public, and people would come to me and say, like, we're trying to change, can you help? And that was my work for 20 years, and unbelievably interesting.
So one of the things I remember hiring a consulting firm to help our company with some issues. And I said to the firm, what's the most typical response when your work when it's done? And they said, the most typical response is that it's completely ignored. And so then they ignore most people ignore the hard parts. So I then committed to myself that, okay, I'm going to be a different client. I'm not going to ignore the hard parts. And we didn't, but it took a kind of a wake up to that. And I guess so the question is, to what extent did you see your clients embrace the hard part? Or is there a story about when they did embrace the hard part?
One of my favorite professional moments was when I was working with a very large pharmaceutical company. And we were looking, I was helping them look at, they were doing the hard work, I was just sort of hanging out and helping. They were doing a project on whether they should introduce what's called targeted diagnostics. So it turns out that for many people, many of the most commonly prescribed drugs are ineffective because humans differ widely. And ideally, you would take a diagnostic test before you took a drug to check that it was going to work for you. And we were working on this project. It turned out not to be as big as we thought it was, but it's still pretty big in many fields, and diagnostic testing is now a thing. And I remember about halfway through the project, the head of the marketing department said to the CEO, but wait, if we do diagnostic testing, our sales will fall. And the CEO looked him in the eye, I've never forgotten this, and said, so tell me, are you keen to go on selling drugs that won't work to sick people? Because that's what you do. When you sell a drug to someone whose genetic profile doesn't match it, you're selling a drug that won't work for them to someone who's sick. And I remember it came from such a deep place of wanting to do the right thing for customers. And I'm not blaming the head of the marketing and sales department. He was a good guy. He was paid on his revenue stream. That was just a natural thing to say. But the moments I've seen change are when, like you, Jonathan, forgive me for saying, like you decided to take on the hard stuff. And that's what this CEO did. And it's still a very successful pharmaceutical company. And he was a fabulous CEO, and they made a lot of progress.
So how do we create the conditions? So by the way, the framework of our talk is we're in a world in which we're losing biodiversity by the minute, and the climate is changing with all kinds of terrible consequences, and racism is pervasive, and political polarization is increasing, and income inequality is growing. These are the hard things that are in front of us. How do we create the conditions in which leaders, particularly leaders of businesses, but I'll take all leaders, I'll take political leaders too, are there ways to create conditions in which they're more willing to take on the hard stuff?
So I will answer your question, Jonathan, but just before we go there, I think there's something implicit in what you said that troubles me. And that's that somehow it's up to the leaders. And the sense I got from you, I don't know if you meant it, was you meant CEOs and divisional presidents and prime ministers and senators. I mean, you meant sort of elite. And they were the leaders, and how do we create the conditions in which those leaders will change? And I want to call that out for a number of reasons. One is I think it's a great question. Those are the people who have their hands on the levers of power right now. So absolutely, we have to, think about how to support them and create the conditions that will help them change. But, and I think there are two big buts. The first but is, I know, I sound like a trite leadership book, but there are leaders everywhere. And it's really true. As I worked with firms that changed, and that's what I've done throughout my career, I saw often that it wasn't the CEO or the divisional president. It was the person 2 levels down making a nuisance of themselves in a polite and constructive way by doing things differently or introducing inconvenient data that was actually driving change. I mean, to be very concrete about this, Paul Polman gets a ton of credit for transforming Unilever, and he deserves it, absolutely. But when you look in detail at the history of how Unilever shifted, one of the contributory factors is that when Paul came in as CEO to that company and thought, shall I go for this sustainable agenda? And remember, Unilever did this 15, 20 years ago when it was not fashionable and it was a very risky thing to do. He looked around the company and he found several examples. In my book, I talk about a guy called Michael Lennox, who was in the tea business and who had decided the only way to decommodify the tea business was to embrace sustainability. And he was pushing that agenda and he was meeting with some success and a lot of challenges. But there are leaders everywhere. So I think I would rather reframe the question as how do we change the conditions so we all start thinking about change? Because that's my second but, which is the biggest condition for the existing elite leadership to change what they do is for everyone else to insist that they do so. I'm a huge fan of purpose and having a guiding star, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about it. But I'm also a big fan of my investors insist, my shareholders insist, my employees are screaming. I mean, I remember one CEO I knew very well who a few years ago called me up and said, Rebecca, I think all this purpose sustainability stuff is bullshit. And I said, yeah, Fred, I know you feel that. Fred's not his real name. We were very good friends. And he said, but everyone I'm trying to hire insists that I say something about climate change and equity and inequality. And would you come and talk to us about it? And so I did. And now he transformed the company. It's very values driven now because, and we'll get to this too, that turned out to be actually a better way to run the company and a better thing for his shareholders. So what do we do to create the conditions? We insist. And I could go into a list of the accounting metrics we should adopt and how we should change the financial system. And there's a lot of concrete things we could do. We could pass, for example, a carbon tax or a price on carbon. We need to insist our politicians change the rules so that firms have to do the right thing. So there's lots and lots of things we should do, but it starts with everyone. It doesn't, there are some amazing leaders at the top who have made these decisions. But most people are just trying to make payroll and need some support.
So I want to delve further into this collective, not only responsibility, but ability to create a transition. And clearly the system we have is not working. And it's also clear that investors and people who lead companies, and so many people are embedded in a system. It's very hard to change a system when you're embedded in it. I'm going to start with a quote from you from 2010, when you attended a climate mind and behavior program at the Garrison Institute, and Time Magazine wrote an article about it, and in it they quoted you. And they quoted you saying, "Simple models of human behavior where I pursue only my own interests are far too limited," said Rebecca Henderson, the co-director, which you were then, of Harvard Business School's Business and Environment Initiative. Humans are much more cooperative and empathetic than that. So let's talk about what does it take to reframe the world in which we're functioning in, to bring out the element of humans that can be cooperative and compassionate and empathetic.
I wish you'd ask me questions about accounting measures, Jonathan. They're much easier.
That would be an underutilization of you, Rebecca.
A misuse of scarce human capital. Okay. There's so much embedded in your question. Let's start at the beginning. And for me, the beginning is that humans are complicated. We are, on the one hand, highly competitive, aggressive, status conscious, prone to violence. And on the other, we are deeply altruistic, loving beings who seek purpose and meaning and rejoice in our families and our communities and would literally lay down our lives for our children. And humans are analytic and focused and break problems into pieces and take them apart and invent science and technology. And humans are also mystical and transcendental and understand that not everything can be divided into pieces and understand that not everything has a technical answer. So for me, that's kind of the fundamental. And I read that as consistent with at least 2,000 years of literature and philosophy and most of modern psychology. And we're living in a world, though, in which we've let one view get much more dominant than the other. So we're living in a world, I'm caricaturing now because it's a very complicated place, but to a first approximation, I think many of us get the very strong signal from the very beginning that the way to succeed is to do the individualistic, competitive, status-driven, I'm big person on campus, and it's all about the science, and it's all about breaking the problem down into bits, and it's all about solving the problem, and look what we built. And Jonathan, I think it's really important to appreciate this, is look what we built. I mean, in my father's lifetime, GDP per head quintupled. And that was when the population of the world tripled. I mean, the combination of modern science and technology and the kind of competitive dynamics unleashed by free markets, whoa! And we have these quite startling statistics, like fewer children die from malnourishment today than did in, I don't want to be quoted in Time magazine on this, but I'm ballpark right, than in 1800. That's not as a percentage of the world's population, that's total kids. Antibiotics, computers, you name it. So I think it's really important to realize that that side of human beings can accomplish an enormous amount. Now, as you said, it turned out that sort of working only from that side of yourself turned out to have a massive downside. Like really a massive downside, like we appear to be about to completely destabilize the world's climate, poison the oceans, and consign future generations to untold suffering for thousands of years. This feels like a bad idea. So as an economist, I can tell you what the answer is. As an economist, the answer is to cooperate. Because my guess, Jonathan, if we made you total dictator of the planet, even if you were pretty self-centered and only interested in making money for yourself, you would do something about climate change. And you would do something about massive inequality and racial injustice, not only because you think it's the right thing to do, but because it's going to destabilize the world's political systems big time. And besides, if we address these problems, we'd have a much bigger market to sell to. That would be good. So what we have is a cooperative problem. And then the other part of me that is the non-rational part, that is the non-economist part, goes, well, this is just wrong. We have to act. Being human is about caring for the natural world and about my family and my community. And that's the part of me that's happy to step up and make some small sacrifices and take some risks and do things in a different way. So when you're asking me, how do we create the condition for things to really change, you're essentially asking, how do we overturn the dominant worldview and move towards those parts of ourselves, I was going to say forgotten, but of course, many people have not forgotten them. Many people live lives of service and compassion and are completely devoted to social justice and spend their lives caring for children and working in prisons and hospitals. And so there's, millions of human beings who never lost that side of themselves. But somehow we have to rebalance so that our institutions don't continually reward the maximized profits right now, don't care about the effects you have on everyone else. We've got to make it so that we have simultaneously a massive social and cultural movement that rediscovers who we are in all our complexity. And I think movements like, well, I'm spiritual but not religious is a part of that. And the interest in mindfulness is a part of that. And the interest of so many young people in working for the common good is part of that. So we really have to strengthen that. So massive social, cultural, political movement, but we also need to change the rules of the game. So people who are, one author said, well, the corporations are psychopaths. If we had individuals who behaved like corporations, we'd think they were psychopaths. So let's change the rules so that you can't be psychopathic anymore. And it's that combination. I think it will have to happen sort of hand in hand. If I imagine a future, and I think you can imagine incredibly healthy and beautiful and welcoming future, one in which everyone is valued. Millions of people don't die every year from the consumption of fossil fuels, from the pollution that fossil fuels create. So that's how I think about this question, I think. Does that make sense?
Yes, although I want to expand it. Okay. Because what you described to me is a very Western worldview. And there have been thousands of cultures for, we now think well over 100,000 years, that have had many different worldviews. And they have had worldviews. There have been cultures that have been warlike, and there have been cultures that have been much more reciprocal. There have been cultures that have been deeply grounded in mutuality between humans and mutuality between humans and nature. So we know that humans have these capacities. And we have created a system that has created material benefits that perhaps have distorted our view of what matters. And by the way, having child health and having drugs for neglected diseases and having well-being and comfort are important things. I don't want to undermine those accomplishments in any way. But those accomplishments, we're seeing a dramatic decline in actually mental well-being, certainly in the Western world, with dramatic increase in teenage suicide and disengaged males and middle-aged male suicide and many other symbols of our. There's a general sense, I think, really of angst and anxiety in the air. There's much less sense of peace. There's much more sense of concern. So the culture is not ultimately delivering well-being. And there are these other ways of knowing that have been around for a long time that are all other kinds of human capacities. So I'd love to hear if you've thought of this, and if you haven't, you can just say so. But if we're going through a transition, so the current system is not working, and you can feel the elements of its breakdown in climate change and biodiversity loss and racism, income inequality, but also in the general anxiety of society. So every culture comes with a language, and it's hard to use our current language to express the future state that we want. It's like Newtonian physics couldn't describe quantum mechanics. So first of all, I'd love to know if you have an image of as something like that you see in your mind or could imagine of what that future state would look like and feel like. And then what would be the language that we need to change to help us get there?
So you're right. I describe the problem using Western terms because I think the Western worldview is the source of the mess we're in now. And I think you were gentle in your description. I talked to a fair number of people under 30, and I would describe them as being in despair. Really problematic. You burnt the world for your own interest and you left us with this. So much anger, so much despair. And these are privileged kids born in the West. It's a very, very bad time. And you point towards other societies and other cultures that have done things differently. And I think one of the things that's exciting in our own culture is seeing the emergence of these different views into the common conversation. And I'm thinking of books like Braiding Sweetgrass, or podcasts like On Being, or increasing interest in Native American cultures and ways of being. I think some of the interest in psychedelic drugs and the recognition that many cultures use psychedelic drugs as a way to access the transcendent and to build a sense of community. And the new research that's coming out in books like Awe, which is so exciting, suggesting that humans used to have all kinds of mechanisms. We used to have these mechanisms, dancing together, being together, taking time to appreciate the community and music and stories. So we know there's another way of being. Do we need a new language? I think we will find we create a new language. I think one of the great questions of our time, perhaps the greatest, but perhaps it's just because it's a question that obsesses me, so I think it's the great question, is how we talk about this transition in a way that can hold the anxiety and the fear and the fear of the unknown. And so I think it's very important that there are people who are saying, yeah, you know, the Native Americans had it right. We should all be meditating right now. And, you know, let's stop consumption and let's do things really differently. And let's build an entirely new society and let's go. And I think that's an incredibly important part of how we will change, is having that kind of very clear vision and visions of many different kinds of places. But I think it's really important to give people room and space to find their way through this in their own way. And this comes from all my work studying change for so long, Jonathan. I once worked with a CEO who was trying to change his organization and was having a great deal of trouble. And finally, he called everyone into the room together and he said, this is his top 200 managers, I've worked out what's wrong. You know what's wrong? You're stupid. I gave you the vision for the future and you can't implement it. Now, I highly recommend against this as a change strategy. In the first place, calling people stupid, you get terrible reactions. And in the second, it's not true. This change is hard for people. And so if it's me, I think we need to find the ways to help everyone in their own lives rediscover this other way of being. And not to load it with a whole bunch of terminology or make it seem something infinitely distant. I mean, our society just 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you pick it. Lots of time for our neighbors, lots of time for each other, lots of time for faith traditions. Now, there's all kinds of issues with organized religion. And, we know no organized religion has been without its scandals and its horriblenesses. But at the core of all the great faith traditions is this idea that there is something bigger than myself and that my community is central. And at the core of the Enlightenment, the very beginning of the rational values we cherish so much, is a commitment to truth and well-being and taking care of each other. So we have these deep moral commitments. Now, the way I frame them may not be the way you frame them. And I'm sure there are some issues we disagree with at the margin. But if you really push me at the base, there's something I really care about. And so I've had the great privilege of working a little bit with Professor Marshall Gans at the Kennedy School, who dropped out of Harvard as an undergraduate to participate in the Freedom Summer, worked in the civil rights movement, helped organize the farm workers, then came back to Harvard, finished his undergraduate degree, got a PhD at MIT. He's the most amazing man, and is now teaching at Harvard still. I mean, he's 79, it's amazing, got more energy than I do. He does a thing called public narrative, which is a group process, which invites everyone in the group to think about their own values and what they really want and where those values came from, and to communicate those to others in the group. And so you take a day or 2 days or 3 days, you go round the group, people talk about what's really important to them and why they tell incredible stories of what's really central to them. And that, rather than coming in and saying, okay, this is the new mindset I want you to have, that process where you discover it together and you discover together where you want the group to go, that is mind-blowing. And I think I've seen successful leaders in companies do that. Again, using different kinds of language. But I saw Paul at Unilever say, okay, we're going to start with individual purpose. Why are you on planet Earth? Why do you come to work every day? What is it you really care about? And really starting with the individual in a context in which, and I hate to be an economist, but you have to give people a living wage. You have to give them control over their schedules. It's no good saying, well, join me in mighty purpose if you're working a terrible job and you can't make ends meet, you can't pick up your kids at school. So, we need to do this in harmony. But that would be my route, is yes, let's have novels and books and conversations about where we want to go and what it might look like. But on a day-to-day basis, let's meet people where they are with love and respect. Because nobody, except maybe a very few who are making out like bandits, nobody likes where we're going now. And that's the energy we should use.
And do you see, at the Garrison Institute, we think a lot about what we call field development, which is how do you take disparate pieces and weave them into a holistic pattern? Do you see a field emerging of this? Do you see a way of connecting these individual, I have a follow-up question to this, but anyway, do you see a way that, because we're in a world in which the forces of profit and materialism are so overwhelmingly powerful that a lot of individual efforts need to be connected if they're going to have countervailing power. Do you see a process by which that's happening?
Oh, Jonathan, I should put you on the spot. You've been thinking about this issue for many years. You were the one that kind of first put it on my radar. But yes, I do see a few things. I see that conversations about purpose-driven capitalism and sustainable business and the idea that firms should think of profit as a means to an end, but not the end in itself, that the goal of the firm is to create a thriving and prosperous society, and that's what we should be striving for. I see those conversations moving from the fringe to something that looks more and more like the center. I mean, when I first started talking about these kinds of ideas, my colleagues thought that I had lost my mind. They were always very polite. But I know this because one of my colleagues said to me years later, she said, Rebecca, sorry about that. You were right. Climate change was a problem, and so was inequality, and so was race. And well, yes, business should do something about it. Sometimes people say, how do you know? How did you know? And I always find that funny because like it's been staring us in the face. So I do see change. And I see much more openness among the students I work with to have these kinds of conversations. But do I have a master plan as to how we catalyze this at scale across the global society? I do not.
Yet.
But I am planning to launch a course next year. Very small, just a small group to get things off the ground, which will be basically this question, which is okay. We need to cooperate at scale. We need to fundamentally rethink how we're running things. Everything's going in the wrong direction pretty much at the moment now, not everything, but nearly everything. And what do we do next? So I am going to try and support that conversation. And to be fair, I think that's happening in many, many places. I think I'm symptomatic of something much broader. I think those conversations are happening in churches and community groups and around the water cooler, where there is a water cooler. I think this is the big conversation, and that's what's emerging. It's in the poetry. I mean, I've become a huge fan of, I'm going to blank on her name and lose all credibility, Jory Graham, The Dream of Unified Field Theory. Fabulous poet. Absolutely fabulous poet. And she was asked in a recent interview in the New Yorker, what do you think is the great question for our time? And she gave such a fantastic answer. She said something like, how do we face what is happening and act and not lose joy and connection at the same time? How do we do this work? How do we get sufficiently grounded in who we are and the people we love that we can move forward in the sure and certain knowledge that nothing any one of us can do will make a difference? How do we do that? And that seems to me the question. And that's an individual question. And then that branches out into how do we create the institutions and the support for many millions of people all over the world? Because to your earlier point, answers to this question are going to come not just from the West. In fact, my work on innovation suggests they won't come from the West. They'll come from the edge. What we think of, what we in the West think of as the edge, but you know, many of these societies would say, we've been around a very long time. We know what we're doing. Maybe it's time you listened. So I think it's a very exciting time, but I do not have an answer. I absolutely do not. Just a commitment to keep asking the question.
So you recently took a long sabbatical. You're still in the middle of a long sabbatical,
Yes.
Although you seem to be edging back into life in the world.
Well, it was hard to really take sabbatical. I think there was about a 3-month period where I really did no work, but or did other kind of work, but yeah. But it's been amazing to have some time not teaching and not doing administration to think about some of these issues.
And what, in the quietest moments of your sabbatical, what did you learn?
I learned that being quiet is really important. I learned that moving too fast makes you ill. I'm fine, but operating on high alert and working flat out for many years has left, deep physical residues that I'm still working with and will continue to work with. So, running all the time, being anxious all the time, it makes you sick. And it makes you unable to think in new ways, or at least it makes it much harder. And it makes you afraid and lonely. Now, don't get me wrong, I had a wonderful life and an amazing career. But slowing down, taking more time, just sending odd notes to my friends, stopping and taking time and talking to strangers. I got into meditating, just having time to just sit quietly for a little bit. And that's been fantastic. And it reminded me, I mean, I used to teach this. I had a research project on overload and how all of us, particularly organizations, were overloaded. And that made it very hard to think creatively and really depressed the performance of the organization. I had a book contract for this book, but my co-author and I were too overloaded to write it. So I learned what, lesson one, take time. Has to be slack in the system, step back, relax. So that's one thing I learned. Another thing I learned, this is going to sound totally crazy, okay? But I sort of had the illusion that if I ran fast enough and tried hard enough and gave enough talks and taught enough classes and sold enough books, that I could fix something. Well, there's millions of us, billions of us. And what I learned is, of course, you can't do it all yourself. It's a craziness to think you can. That you have to find this midpoint, or this is what I found for myself. I don't know if it's true for other people, but there's a midpoint between thinking I am the lone hero who's going to shift the system, and I think I'll sit home and read murder mysteries, which, don't get me wrong, I love reading murder mysteries, but there's somewhere in between. And I hope I said earlier in our conversation that we can only do this together, and we can only do it at a measured pace, and we can only do it if we're living the change we're talking about. So if you say you're saving the world, but you treat other people around you as if they were things, I'm thinking of a certain billionaire on the West Coast, that's not good. It's not going to take us where we want to go. So that's what I learned.
So those qualities of finding space, of integrating a path from individual well-being to organizational well-being to systemic well-being, these are things that lie outside of the capitalist system. So I want to focus on the word capitalist for a second, capitalism. So capitalism is the ism of capital, and it does a very good job of protecting capital, growing capital, focusing on capital. The word itself reveals its purpose, which is the purpose of capital, but the purpose of capital happens not to be the purpose of well-being, the well-being of humans in nature, the relief of suffering of all sentient beings. Capital might be able to help. It might be one of the tools, but capital is purely a mental construct. It's a completely abstract, economics are things we made up. Gravity is real. Economics are constructed, socially agreed upon systems. They're not, they don't have an inherent existence the way gravity or quantum fields have. And even quantum fields may not have an inherent existence. So, I know I'm going to ask you a question which you can turn down because your expertise is really in the capitalist system. And I'm really asking, how do we make capitalism not the center of gravity of what we do, but become a tool and make individual, organizational, and systemic well-being the center of gravity of what we do?
I do not know. I think we have to learn. If I had to guess right now, my guess would be we need something like a massive spiritual revival that is secular. Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, wrote an entire book about public religion. In the French Revolution, they put the Catholic Church out of business and tried to create a secular religion. Why? Because they wanted people to focus on the common good. and the long term. Now, there were some bumps along the way, but the French Revolution did a lot of amazing things. And so I think they were onto something. I don't know if the great faith traditions are part of this. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know if it differs across countries and regions of the world, but it looks something like a spiritual awakening.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote a book called The Ethics for the New Millennium around 2000, and then he tried to create a movement called secular ethics.
Yes.
What's interesting is also, although His Holiness Pope Francis has not, he remains firmly Catholic. He also, with Laudato Si, has tried to expand spirituality into to be more pervasive and a deep ethical worldview, a more pervasive.
I mean, I think it's one of the great problems that we're stuck with this word spiritual, because it makes it sound as if you and I were talking about spirits.
Right.
And I'm like, we're not. And I, at least, am not talking about existential beliefs about the nature of reality or whether there's a divine being or whether we survive after death. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. When I say spiritual, in our culture, that word has come to stand for thinking about the big questions. What is the meaning of life? What is my purpose? Where will I find meaning? What is the role of love? We've sort of so constricted the discourse space in the West that it's all kind of taken refuge under this word. And the great faith leaders like Dalai Lama or like Pope Francis, the faith traditions were traditionally how humans handled these issues. Is we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves. Our society relies on the fact that we care about each other and not just about ourselves. And by the way, your well-being depends on your acting that way too. You know, I've always loved Buddhist ethics because, as I understand it, the Buddha said, you know, do the right thing because that's going to make you by far happier in the long term. He said, I think, if you knew what generosity would do for your well-being as much as I know, you would give away everything you had. Which sounds kind of like what Jesus of Nazareth said, right? So there's a deep truth about what makes humans work well and what makes human societies work well that I think the anthropologists and the archaeologists are beginning to uncover, that's been sort of held in this construct we call religion or spirituality. But probably we need different language, we need different ways in, because I know a lot of people, including my husband and my son, who are like, spiritual? I don't do that. And they are sort of more loving, caring human beings. You know, so how do we find a way to express this such that everybody can join in and we can really find that as a way forward? I don't know. I really don't know. But my hope, and this is what I learned through my work on innovation, my belief is even now, hundreds and thousands of people are trying to answer that question. And that's how we'll find the way forward.
Yes.
Is by experiment, by trying.
My sense also is that if we can develop a language that is grounded in ethics and a spiritual sense of the wholeness of the world, or our mission to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings, or repair the fabric of the world, or to bring grace into the world. These are all different languages for how to do the same thing. My sense is that that's actually also how we repair the great political split that we're seeing in the United States.
Oh, for sure. For sure, for sure. The answer, I think, the answer to the great political split is love. And I'm an economist and an engineer. I feel so odd saying that in public, but it is. And again, I learned that from my innovation work. You don't turn to the old firm and say, well, you know, you don't know what you're doing. You say, tell me how you see the world. What's important to you? What values do you have? Humans are deeply values driven, but we've lost that. We've lost sight of it. And at root, we all want what's best for our children.
So the answer is love. That's a I have more questions, but I want to end on that because that's the perfect ending. The answer is love. Is there more you want to say about the answer is love?
No. Just that this old way of being is so deeply embedded in us. I want to tell you how great I am at math and at thermodynamics to show that I'm a serious person, because serious people don't talk about love. But I think that has to change. I think love is the answer, and we absolutely have to rediscover that.
And it is a foundation. It's actually, I think, a foundation upon which one can build a whole society or a whole community. One of so I run a for-profit business, and I participate very deeply in the global financial system, the global capital system. So I not only understand it, I function within it and benefit tremendously from it. And yet what I recognize is that we try and materialize things. And one of the great problems we now see with social media is we've tried to materialize relationships, or we've let others materialize relationships, and in exploitive ways. And what's interesting about love is the word carries with it a purity that that in its own nature. Remember earlier I asked you about, so what are the words we need? So the word love is boundless, it's infinite, and yet it has a boundary, which is that it doesn't like if you exploit, then it's not love. If you materialize or capitalize on it, then it's not love. And so it's both infinite, and yet at the same time, it holds its center. So my sense is we need more words. So I once asked Joanna Macy this question, and she said the word is care.
Oh, yeah. Because I was going to Immanuel Kant. The idea that we should never, ever use another human being as a means to an end. That is love, is to always respect and cherish the innate dignity of every human being.